cover a topic that gets to the heart of M&A actually for startups, but this is a decision that you make years before and yet can have a major impact on the outcome. And I guess you have to make this decision at least 5 years before. And that question is the question of QSBS versus an S-Corp as your corporate structure. Now, if you're a tech startup or startup producing anything innovative, then generally speaking, you can seek what's called a qualified small business designation. And this QSBS designation does something very specific, and many of you will know this. Basically, this is what it means. It means that the first 10 million is tax-free. What do I mean by the first 10 million? I don't mean the first 10 million in value for the company as a whole. I actually mean the first 10 million in cap gains for each shareholder. There are more specifics, like investors that come in like after a $50 million valuation and so on don't get this. But certainly for all the founders and the early stage investors, and really here I'm focused on the founding team and those folks, early employees, this is pretty huge, right? 10 million tax-free. And you can take this further because if you put any of the money in your kid's name or in trusts, there's what's called stacking of these QSBS designations. So stacking via trusts or kids or actually anyone that you want to give money to, because really what this involves doing is giving them shares. And so there are approaches you can take there. I'll leave that to the lawyers. I guess the usual disclaimer, I'm not a lawyer or a CPA, so your mileage will vary. But anyway, 10 million tax-free, that's a big deal. If you choose to split the money up or use some of these more complex approaches, you could make that 20 or 30 million. But we'll just go with the 10 million. So that's a great benefit of QSBS. But beyond that, if you have a valuation higher than that, then you're going to pay 23.8% cap gains, so 23.8% above 10 million. So that's the rate you're going to pay. And, all right, so if I cut this in half and then we talk about the S-Corp side of the equation, just to compare these two options, because when you incorporate, you can, to be QSBS actually, should add, you've got to be a C Corp. And so this is C Corp QSBS up here. Or you could switch to be a C Corp, but you've got to be in the QSBS status. You've got to be a C Corp for 5 years before selling. So 5-year holding period, and then you can take advantage of this. On the S-Corp side of the equation, you don't get any tax-free anything, right? It's all straight up. But the tax rate for cap gains is 20%, and that's from zero. So starting, right from the bottom, 20%. But hey, that rate is actually lower than what you experience on the QSBS side. So there is a point at which it's actually more advantageous. If you have a big exit, it can actually be more advantageous to be an S-Corp, which most people don't talk about. And so if we draw a little graph here, just to illustrate what I mean. So we draw this little graph, then the first 10 million in value. So let's just say that this is value of the company on this axis, and this is the actual taxes that you got to pay. Let's do it that way. So with the QSBS option, the first 10 million is tax-free, right? So it's zero up to that point, and then it'll start rising from there, something like that. Now, with the S-Corp, it's 20% from zero. So you're going to start getting taxed right from the beginning, but it's a slightly lower rate. And so what ends up happening is something like this. There's a crossover point where it becomes better to be an S-Corp, crossover point in value. And if you do the math, it's not complex math. It turns out that crossover point is right around 63.5 million. So right around there. So it's a pretty big number. The most founders, their own share of their startup And honestly, this even goes for some unicorn exits, depending on the situation. Most individual founders, many times, they will not cross that number, even with $1 billion exit, because the founding shares get split many ways, so many investment rounds, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so this isn't a problem for most people. And so therefore, in most cases, the C Corp is actually advantageous. There's one other exception that I would make to that rule, though, which is, what if you're actually profitable? Like, what if you're running a bootstrap company and you're generating profits year after year, once you get going? Well, then you save a substantial amount as an S-Corp versus being a C Corp, because with an S-Corp, all the taxes are passed through, and there's some additional deductions. It ends up being the case that on your profits as an S-Corp, you're going to be paying, and again, this is all federal only, you're going to be paying about 30%. Versus, if you take the C Corp approach, you're going to be paying 21% at the corporate level, and then, let's say you pay that out as a dividend or something like that, you're going to be paying potentially another 18.8 on that. So you end up very close to 40%. So 40 versus 30. So you got about a 10-point advantage for being an S-Corp. And hey, in our case, my last startup, Hidden Levers, we were quite profitable, and we were an S-Corp. Now we were incorporated before these rules that came into existence, but we were an S-Corp. And hey, over the course of our existence prior to exit, we produced roughly $9 million in profits. And so we actually had a savings on taxes on that front. You could look at it as about $900,000 in taxes that we saved by being an S-Corp from that perspective. And so, hey, it does matter. But just to give you a sense, so now the last thing I'll say on this is that the reason that the QSBS and the C Corp is advantageous in most cases is, again, for most folks, your own shares are not going to be worth more than $60 million, even in a successful exit. But the other aspect of this is that think about all of the employees, all the early employees or all the smaller shareholders. They will benefit hugely from, they're all going to be below 10 million in value, right? So they'll all benefit hugely from a 0% tax rate on all of that. So that's a good reason to consider the QSBS approach. And hopefully this gives you a picture on what your options are. Remember, you've got to choose at least 5 years in advance if you want to take advantage of this, 5 years before your exit.